The following is a reading of George Stein's introduction to Franz Kafka's The Trial. The thought that there is anything fresh to be said of Franz Kafka's The Trial is implausible, for three reasons. This short novel has passed into far more than classical literary status. It is a part of the immediacy of recognition and of reference throughout our century. Countless are those who have not read it, who have not even have seen stage, film, or television versions, but who are familiar with its main outline and situations. Scarcely published at his early death, known to a narrow circle of Prague and Vienna acquaintances, Kafka has become an adjective. In more than 100 languages, the epithet Kafkaesque attaches to the central images, to the constants of inhumanity and absurdity in our times. The letter K is his, as S is not Shakespeare's or D Dante's. It is in analogy with Dante and Shakespeare that W. H. Auden placed Franz Kafka as the shaping mirror of our new dark ages. In this osmosis, out of an almost esoteric source, out of one virtually buried alive, the theme of one of his last parables, in this diffusion of the Kafkaesque into so many recesses of our private and public existence, the trial plays a commanding role. The arrest of Joseph K., the opaque tribunals, his literally bestial death, are the alphabet of our totalitarian politics. The lunatic logic of the bureaucracy, which the novel sets out, is that of our professions, litigations, visas, fiscalities, even in the lighter grays of liberalism. The secondary literature is cancerous. It multiplies daily in the academy, in belles lettres, and literary journalism. It is parasitic on every element, one is tempted to say every paragraph, of this inexhaustible text, as do very great works in language, in the arts, or in music. Kafka's fiction invites decipherment and makes of this invitation a trap. However acute the critic, whatever his systematic strengths, be they Marxist, psychoanalytic, structuralist, or in some traditional vein, the readings offered fall almost risibly short. There is, we will see, one exception, nevertheless. The cumulative volume of interpretation and scholarship makes it unlikely that any substantive aspect or salient detail in the trial has been altogether overlooked. Indeed, it is an unguarded access, and the shock of immediacy which are now most difficult to achieve. The third reason why there may be nothing novel and illuminating to be said of Kafka's fable is of most interest. There is a sense in which works of the imagination of sufficient seriousness and density always enact a reflection on themselves. Almost always the major text or work of art or musical composition tells critically of its own genesis. Incomparably, our truest analyst of drama is Shakespeare. Cézanne's paintings enforce a persistent consideration, unrivaled in depth and economy, of the nature and modalities of pictorial representation. The case of Kafka is more specific. There had been inspired lyric poetry written by Jews during the millennia of dispersal and prior to the secularization of literature in a figure such as Heine. There had been isolated experiments in drama and fiction from within the walled community. But broadly speaking, the epic, scenic, lyric, and narrative impulses manifest in the Bible. The New Testament also was in great part written by Jews. is stifled and goes underground between antiquity and the 19th century. The reasons are complicated. They attach to historical circumstance, to social isolation, to linguistic plurality and exile. But they relate also to essential iconoclasm, to a distrust graven at Sinai of mimesis, of the whole semantics of representation for purpose of aesthetic experience, and via means of fiction. More coherently than even the Plato of the Republic or Calvin, Judaism rejects the image. Its elected genre became that of commentary. Each commentary on the revealed scriptures generated further commentary in an unbroken chain and exfoliation of secondary, tertiary discourse. The arcane wit, the delicacy of probing, the finesse of Talmudic, of Midrashic, and Mishnaic commentaries, the fine-spun inventiveness of the acts of reading by orthodox and Kabbalistic masters of textuality are truly accessible only to those schooled in the labyrinth and echo chamber of the rabbinic legacy. The force of this legacy persists in parodistic or bastard guise in such current Judaic derivatives as Freudian psychoanalysis or Derridian deconstruction. Franz Kafka was heir to this methodology and epistemology of commentary, of unending analysis. Freud's phrase. His parables, fables, tales, and always incomplete novels are commentaries in action, in a sense both material and more diffusely Talmudic. The techniques of testing out the abyss, of circling the unnameable, of weaving meaning on meaning, of laboring to make language wholly transparent to a light which consumes that through which it passes, have their antecedent and validation in the twice millenary debates of Judaism with itself. Thus, the trial is not only self-reflexive, as is nearly all mature aesthetic form, it embodies the particular techniques of exegetic commentary, of rabbinic hermeneutics. Self-evidently, Franz Kafka meditates on the law. It is the original mystery and subsequent applications of the law, of legalism and judgment, which are the essential concern of Talmudic questioning. If, in the Judaic perception, the language of the Adamic was that of love, the grammars of fallen man are those of the legal code. It is the modulation from one to the other, as commentary and commentary on commentary seek to hammer it out, which is one of the centers of the trial. Kabbalistic geometries note of ordered constructs with several centers. Set beside Kafka's readings of Kafka, ours are unavoidably feeble. Kafka's breakthrough to the mastery came during the night in September 1912, in which he set down the judgment. This nightmare notation already contains the core of the trial. The ubiquitous theme of guilt in Franz Kafka's life and work has been the object of interminable conjecture. He himself was prodigal of hints and verdicts in respect both of Jewish ideals and of his father's brutality, voiced expectations. Kafka pronounced himself an abject failure, a deserter. He had founded no family. His career in the insurance business was at best middling. Literary success on any conventional and public scale eluded him almost entirely. His physique solicited amused sympathy or troubled prognostication. Where his father was coarsely robust, Franz existed shadow-like. his vehemently gnarled relations with women, the lengthy engagement to Felice Bauer, his love for Milena, aborted. At the edge of commitment, Kafka flinched and took sanctuary in illness. This illness, the tubercular condition, was real enough. It was to cause early death. But Kafka himself and his intimates were too percipient, were too aware of psychosomatic etiology of consumption not to observe the contracts between patient and infirmity. Kafka used his sickness as it used him, and this reciprocity deepened his sense of culpability. Guilt inhabited both his language and his art, the two being inextricable. A Prague Jew assimilated to German language and culture, momentarily drawn to rising Czech nationalism, but in essence an outsider, even a traitor to it, stood on condemned ground. Compelling alternatives loomed. Significant literary work was being done in Yiddish. The renaissance of Hebrew as a modern tongue, immemorially rooted in Jewish experience, was palpably imminent. Kafka looked with wary pathos in both these directions. Yet he chose German for his truths. He tells of his estrangement within the very tongue of his genius, of his incapacity to sense meaning in the word mother, when it is Mutter, a remark the more lacerating in that it points deliberately to the absence of a mother tongue. The translucency of Kafka's German, its stainless quiet, suggests a process of borrowing at high, very nearly intolerable interest. Kafka's vocabulary and syntax are those of utmost abstention from waste, as if every German word and grammatical resource had been drawn from an unforgiving bank. To write in German was to be in debt. To have done so in Czech, Yiddish, or Hebrew might have been more licit, but only partially. I have cited the iconoclasm radical to Judaism, the unease of imaginary contrivance. The precedent of Heine, baptized, rent between languages, a victim of venereal disease, appeared to confirm Jewish sentiment. Scholarship, particularly when in reach of religious studies and exegesis, was one thing. The avocation to belles lettres was something altogether different. At many levels and in contrast with the eminent friend Max Brod, Kafka acknowledged the justice of this distinction. To mute his calling by not writing would be to incur guilt, but to write made-up stories in pursuit of seemingly profane fulfillment was most likely an even worse transgression. The circle closed on Kafka as it does on man serving a life sentence in the round of the prison yard. And just as a personal note, I would like to go over this again and reread this particular sentence when he's suggesting a unity between two things here. It didn't come off that way when I read it, so I'll reread it. The precedent of Heine, baptized, rent between languages, a victim of venereal disease, appeared to confirm Jewish sentiment. Okay, and then the second sentence which follows. Scholarship, particularly when in reach of religious studies and exegesis, was one thing. They're one and the same, one thing together, right? Carrying on. Yet even these motives for self-condemnation, even these crimes, grave as they are, do not define the source. Franz Kafka lived original sin. The theology, the Rhetoric of this condition has been pervasive in the West after the Pentateuch, after Pauline and Augustinian readings of human affairs. It has, for example, in stringent Calvinism, the seasons of apocalyptic penitential fear darkened communities. But a mere handful of individuals have ever endured in their daily existence the conviction and consequence of their fallen state. Like Pascal and Soren Kierkegaard, here the analogies are non-trivial, Kafka knew hours, days perhaps, in which he identified personal life itself with ineradicable existential guilt. To be alive, to engender further life, was to sin against the enraged Father, against the lost sanctities of a creation made corrupt and sordid by man. It was at some enigmatic deeps to sin against oneself to the precise degree that survival entails lies, the failures of love, suffering, and the anguish which whispers pitilessly out of the great winds from under the earth. Only a psyche possessed by this interdiction could have written that those voices whose song sounds angelic are in fact in the pit of hell, or could have said, though the citation is disputed, that there is abundance of hope, but none for us. To live is to be sentenced for living. This is the metaphysical but also private dynamic of the trial. Written during 1914 and 1915, the book was published in 1925, a year after Franz Kafka's death. Its translation into English by Edwin and Willa Muir, which followed in 1935, itself took on a classic aura. This is in one sense regrettable. Max Brode's recension of Kafka's text had been amateurish and at certain points arbitrary. Despite its famous conclusion, the trial remains unfinished, and there is argument about the order of various chapters. Additional and cancelled matter has survived, and this can be found in the appendix to the present edition. It is, however, the Muir version, with its stylistic distinction and freshness of encounter, which so far as the English language world goes, remains canonic. But Muir's reading and the translation which it underwrites are distinctly his. Religion was, says Muir, the whole world to Kafka. His imagination moves continuously within that world and does not acknowledge that there is anything, no matter how trivial or undignified, which it does not embrace. Accordingly, it is, in its unique way, a complete world, a true though unexpected reflection of the world we know. And when Kafka deals in it with the antinomies of religion, he is throwing light at the same time on the deepest riddles of human life. The religious core, claims Edwin Muir, is that of the incommensurabilities between divine and human law which Kafka adopted from Kierkegaard. For such adoption there is hardly any evidence. Muir reads out of a Kierkegaardian Calvinism. He misses something altogether, the immersion of the trial in motifs and concerns of radically Judaic-Talmudic kind. If, moreover, one is to grasp the pungent terror of Kafka's fiction, it is vital to test approaches of a non-religious tenor. Marxist glosses have been reductive but enlightening when they insist on the sociology of the black fable. Original as it is, the trial has its antecedents and its material context. The Comédie Humaine of Balzac, the caricatures of Daumier, are replete with acrid depictions of the law of judges, advocates, and snoring juries. Jarndyce vs. Jarndyce in Dickens' Bleak House fascinated Kafka and inspired numerous touches in the trial. Specifically, it was the persona, at once self-important and pathetic, of the clerk and the bureaucracy which the clerk inhabits or infests, which attracted the satiric, spellbound novice of the 19th century novel. Here indeed was a new fauna bred of the swift process of administrative, fiscal, statistical services and agencies, both public and private, which made possible the Industrial Revolution and the parallel instauration of the modern national state. Again, Balzac is seminal, but it is in Russian fiction, in the tales of Gogol and the novels of Dostoevsky, Kafka was steeped in, both authors, that the clerk, harried to the point of madness by his contemptuous superiors, by the ashen monotone of his labors, and by poverty, yet avenging himself on the unfortunate who require his arcane services, becomes archetypal. He figures crucially in both Dickens and Flaubert. The pressures on Kafka's attention of l'éducation sentimentale and of Bouvard et Pécuchet, in which the barren pomp of the new clerisy is monumentalized, was intense. K is out of that rodent tribe. The maze in which he operates and is entrapped, the instrumental routines, absurdities, and pretense which characterize the tribunal, the bank, the idiom of lawyers and tellers point immediately to the structures of the decaying Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. In the trial, and in Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, the bureaucratic hydropsy of the Habsburg twilight are the very substance of the fiction. Kafka's politics were those of a fitful outrage. His daily practice as an assessor of insurance claims, frequently arising from industrial accidents, put him in raw touch with the miserie of the exploited and the unctuous cunning of their masters. At the same time, he had few illusions about the mendacities and opportunism with which the humbled and offended seek retribution and maneuver for survival. The result is throughout Kafka's writings, but most notably in the trial and in the castle, a mordant strain of social satire. Marxist commentators are right when they isolate the transparent analyses of an inefficient, wasteful, often self-contradictory liberal capitalism on the edge of catastrophe in the trial. They, but by no means they alone, are justified in emphasizing the intimacies of gesture and of perspective which blind K, the bank official, and sycophant in the social hierarchy to the strictly analogous ambience of the judiciary. No less than Mekobar in Dickens or the maddened clerk in Gogol's Overcoat, Joseph K. is both product and agent in a very particular matrix of bourgeois mercantilism. The sarcasms, the vengeful allegories which fill Das Kapital are more than relevant. They find a nightmare echo in the mere fact that the torture chamber in the novel is located in an enlarged broom closet in K's bank and bureau. More oblique are the sexual themes in this book. For a long time, what was known of Franz Kafka's personal asceticism and infirmities inhibited any clear cognizance of the erotic urgencies in his novels and parables. Unendurably, the fiasco of Kafka's engagement to Felicie Bauer, the FB in the trial, and the aborted relation to Milena, probably the most deeply beloved, bore witness to some central flaw in Kafka's relations with women. Today, the picture is far less clear. The possibility of one or more liaisons of a more or less normal order, even of a child born of one such relationship, cannot be ruled out. But this is trivia. What has emerged, as our readings become more patient, more observant of narrative compaction, is the variousness and significance of eros in Kafka's imaginings. Here as well, social insight plays its part. Kafka is acutely aware of the extended compass of sexual exploitation, of prostitution both public and domestic, of economically enforced compliance in the servants' quarters, which was so graphic a feature of Habsburg Moors. Like Schnitzler, like Karl Kraus, he is at the same time drawn to and repelled by the availability to men of a sexual market in the streets, in the hotels and lodging houses of Vienna or Prague. At a more intricate level, Kafka records the vengeance of women on their users. Intercourse, as we find it pictured in the trial and in the castle, has the crass ambiguity of rape. It humiliates men more than women. It leaves them irreparably soiled and enfeebled. The law student cries out in pain and self-betraying animal rut as the washerwoman, her blouse unbuttoned, allows his embrace. Lenny, lawyer, holds nurse, and sentinel, is a presence of peculiar complexity. She is aroused by the proximity of accused men. She excites herself and her bedridden master by recounting to him her erotic exploits. She collects lovers and snatches at their lust in a style simultaneously submissive and aggressive. It is Kafka's genius for economy which charges these sordid couplings with a strange power of suggestion. Kay kisses Fräulein Bürstner all over the face, like some thirsty animal lapping greedily at a spring of long-sought fresh water. Newly indicated, he seeks reassurance and momentary release in sexual contact. F.B.'s passivity, her pallid ironies, prevent such solace. Kay is made voyeur of her relations to the sickly Miss Montague. There is not one woman among the spectral horde of the accused in the trial. Women are in enigmatic guise, messengers or servants, temple prostitutes of the law. Their palpable immunity from arrest and prosecution is a mark of tainted innocence, of inferiority in respect of the very men over whom they exercise diverse modes of sexual authority. Even more sinister is the swarming hunger of the young girls who cluster harpy-like around the studio of Tintorelli the painter. The German language amalgamates the words for birds with that for fucking. The larger point is this. Rightly, we experience Kafka's vision as one of tragic horror. He stands, as we will note, in a singular relation of clairvoyance to the inhuman, to the absurdly murderous in our condition, the tristitia, the sadness unto death. In Kafka's writings, letters, diaries, and recorded remarks are bottomless. But there is also in him a social satirist, a craftsman of the grotesque, a humorist with an eye to farce and slapstick. The deadpan, the acrobatics of Buster Keaton lie to hand. Reading the blackest of modern myths, the metamorphosis to a circle of aghast intimates, Kafka himself doubled over with laughter. We diminished the conceptual and formal wealth of the trial. We fall short of its haunting duplicity. If we omit the sinews of comedy, Kay is often risible in his stiff posturing, in his starched collar, officiousness. Tintorelli's falsehoods and self-importance are macabre, but also laughable. The successive messengers and acolytes of the court are shapes out of Magritte, at once ominous and of a surrealist humor. Without them we would not have Beckett's clowns. Even the hallucinatory canter towards execution with which the trial concludes hints of a circus. Once this informing context has been allowed, however, and once the politics and the wit, the sex and the clowning in Kafka's art have been fully registered, the obvious truth cries out. Kafka's inventions and the trial preeminently articulate an overwhelming feat of metaphysical religious imagining and inquiry. The techniques of narration and of investigative debate on which they draw, the anguish of spirit and tatters of vision which they verbalize, there is also the oniric stab of Kafka's drawings, communicate obsessions of an intensity of an intensely and exegesic and homiletic provenance. Again, the techniques of narration and of investigative debate on which they draw, the anguish of spirit and tatters of vision which they verbalize, there is also the oniric stab of Kafka's drawings, communicate obsessions of an insistently exegetic, even homiletic provenance, in the midst of a largely secular, indeed positivist climate, in a genre, that of prose fiction, whose historical source and legitimacy points to worldliness, to a grasp of human affairs and relations as immanent, and that would be immanent, IMMANENT, not imminent, and in the main answerable to reason, Kafka composes a body of parables, of allegories, of commentaries in motion, whose aura is technically and substantively that of the sacred. It is in this material respect that Kierkegaard's philosophic fictions and the tales of holiness and the rage of the soul in Dostoevsky are contributory. But the principal code is self-evidently that of the biblical and Talmudic legacy. It is the vexations of Cain and Abel, of Abraham and Isaac, of Job, vexations they suffered and whose riddling, even scandalous justifications they inflicted on the conscience of the West, which are inscribed in the torments and extinction of Joseph K. Elaborations, political, psychoanalytic, anthropological, paradoxistic, on Greek myths are prodigal in 20th century poetry, fiction, drama. Even at the pitch of inspiration, in Ulysses, in T.S. Eliot and Pound, in Brooke's Death of Virgil, the breadth is that of echo, of recognition, that being recognition, not recognition. Again, to be clear, rather than origination. Variants on scriptural and apocryphal themes are rarer. The literacy of biblical reference and response has thinned. It is in this special sense that Faulkner may have been Franz Kafka's truest contemporary. But Kafka's capacity not only to transmute such raw material out of Holy Writ as the story of Babel, but to wake to consuming life the modes of secondary discourse on Scripture as these are practiced in Talmudic, Rabbinic, Midrashic, and one cautiously suspects Kabbalah Kabbalistic strategies remains unique. Borges is a disciple of genius. The purity of Kafka's prose, its wealth of abstinence, intimate that would be abstinence, intimate the ensuring volume of the choral accumulation of the tradition of the revealed and of the hermeneutic which towers behind it. His fictions of uncertain truth represent in their nakedness, in the dread innocence of their questioning, the only form of mundane and signed literary art potentially permissible in the Judaic matrix of Torah study and of unbroken dialogue between sanctified text and reader. How else can one entertain the blasphemy of fiction of construal, which entail error and falsehood in excess of God's creation? As I mentioned, there does seem to me to be one act of reading of Kafka which comes near to plumbing the depths. It is that hammered out in the letters of Walter Benjamin, the messianic Marxist and theologian of language, and Gershom Scholem, master of the study of Jewish mysticism. Franz Kafka is present throughout their exchanges, but it was during the summer and autumn of 1938, apropos of Benjamin's repudiation of Max Brode's biography of Kafka, that their perceptions crystallized. The foci in the ellipse of Kafka's work are, for Benjamin, those of mystical experience with particular recourse to the Kabbalistic on the one hand and the fate of the modern city dweller on the other. Acutely, Benjamin links the instability, the ghostliness of modern urban existence to the new physics of indeterminacy. Kafka's folly stems from the precise paradox that it is via the mystical tradition that he gains unrivaled access to modernity. But Kafka's relation to the hermeneutic allegoric tradition is peculiarly that of an eavesdropper. Perhaps not so peculiar. It is peculiar, but it's hardly surprising. Anyway, the main reason why this eavesdropping demands such effort is that only the most indistinct sounds reach the listener. There is no doctrine that one could learn, and no knowledge that one could preserve. The things one wishes to catch as they rush by are not meant for anyone's ears. Kafka's work represents tradition fallen ill. Kafka's writings are by their nature parables. But that is their misery and their beauty, and that they had to become more than parables. They do not lie modestly at the feet of doctrine. When they have crouched down, they unexpectedly raise a mighty paw against it. And that is the quote Stein uses here. What is recuperable for Kafka, so Benjamin, is a sort of theology passed on by whispers, charged with matters discredited and obsolete. The other yield is one of a kind of holy madness, hence Kafka's delight in Don Quixote. Those seeking to help fallen men are fools, but only fools can help. The statement I have cited about abundance of hope, but not for us, becomes in Benjamin's gloss the very source of Kafka's radiant serenity. But one must never lose sight of the fact that the uniquely luminous figure of Franz Kafka is the figure of a failure, a conclusion which Benjamin had already argued in 1934. In reply, Scholem, thoroughly at home in the joys of self-contradiction, offers the simple truth that Kafka's failure was the object of endeavors that, if they were to succeed, would be bound to fail, which is exactly the motion of action and of cognizance in the trial. Does Kafka's parabolic commentary on the revealed really represent a falling ill of the tradition? And another quote here. I would say such an enfeebling is rooted in the nature of the mystical tradition itself. It is only natural that the capacity of tradition to be transmitted remains as its sole living feature when it decays, when it is in the through of the wave. Kafka's techniques are those of commentary, just because it is wisdom that, when it reflects, comments rather than perceives. Kafka is a borderline case of wisdom, representing, as no other writer has, the crisis of the sheer transmissibility of truth. The commentator does indeed have holy scriptures, but he has lost them. The insights and the loss are somehow the same. Together with other letters and with Benjamin's 4 articles on Kafka, this dialogue may well embody the highest in modern arts of meaning. It is apposite that Kafka's fictions should have been its occasions. In a set of notes to the trial jotted down before 1928, Benjamin evokes the theological category of waiting, the primary role of expectancy in the novel. He wonders at the mystery of adjournment in Kafka's scheme. In so doing, he draws us towards the center of the center. Yet here even Benjamin falls short. Known variously as before the law, observe the ambiguity. The doorkeeper or the man from the country, a phrase which in Yiddish carries connotations of obstinate incompetence. The parable spoken by the cleric to Joseph K. in chapter 9 of the trial is the nucleus of the novel and of Kafka's vision. Helplessness seizes one face to face with the page and a half. I am just able to imagine in some primitive perspective. The author of, say, King Lear returning home for lunch and allowing that the morning's work had gone well or poorly. Any such image fails me in respect of the composition of the speeches from the whirlwind in the book of Job, of the central sections of Ecclesiastes, or of chapters 13 to 17 in the fourth gospel. It is equally futile, I feel, in reference to before the law. This text persuades me as being informed by revelation, the knowledge that it is written and published separately from the novel during Kafka's lifetime by the gentleman in a bowler hat going to and from his daily insurance business defies my grasp. My impotence is not an isolated one. Formally, nothing has been added to sacred scriptures in the Jewish canon. But this parable, in the dark of the Prague Minster, has in fact been read and commented upon within liturgical context. It is taking on the primal force of an imponderable verity. There appear to be as many ways of reading before the law as there are modes of trying to conduct the image one's life. Each is partial. Each solicits another attempt. How are we to analyze the unbounded charge of detail, the mirror gallery of successive doorkeepers, the garb of the outermost guardsman, the fleas in an anecdote so sparse and compacted? What trust is to be invested in the speaker, who is at once a holy person and an associate or emissary of the court? Can there be false revelation, or, more exactly, divinely sanctioned truth which becomes falsehood by mere virtue of recital, of disclosure via human discourse? Is the chaplain himself a doorkeeper whose intervention in the cathedral intimates a contiguity, both organic and fatal, between Judaism and Christianity, between law and the arbitrary enigma of grace? And again, folks, just to clarify, that word being contiguity, Contiguity, not to be mistaken for continuity. Duh. Anyway. In turn, these queries grow brittle. They confess their obscuring sophistication before an inviolate signification more innocent and bottomless than any exegesis. The hermeneutic debate between the cleric and Kay as to the import of the fable, with its astute pastiche of Talmudic practices, anticipates our bewilderments but leaves them unresolved. Indeed, the chaplain suggests that Kay's mutinous interpretations of before the law are wholly symptomatic of his own guilt, that we stand condemned by our misprision. One naive gloss is this: the trial is translucent, it stands open to our apprehension as do biblical parables and narrations. If we remain baffled and rebellious to the light of meaning, a light which may well be inhuman in its indifferent purity, if we do not enter a door open and intended for each and every one of us, the guilt, the consequences are ours. Or to put it simply, it is not so much we who read Kafka's words, it is they who read us and find us blank. The foresight of the trial into the inferno of modern bureaucracy, into imputed guilt, into torture, and the again from the top. The foresight of the trial into the inferno of modern bureaucracy, into imputed guilt, into torture, and the enormities of death as these characterize 20th century totalitarian regimes, has been made cliché. The butchery, literal, of Kay has become an icon of political homicide. Kafka's In the Penal Colony, his play on vermin and annihilation in the Metamorphosis were actualized shortly after his death. A concrete fulfillment of augury, of detailed clairvoyance, attaches to his seeming fantastications. Obscurely, but unavoidably, the question of mystery or responsibility nags. Is there some sense in which the provisions spelled out across Kafka's fictions, and most especially in the trial, contributed to their enactment? Could prophecy so mercilessly articulate have been other than fulfilled? Kafka's Milena and his three sisters perished in the camps. The Central European Jewish world, which Kafka ironized and celebrated, went to hideous extinction. The spiritual possibility exists that Franz Kafka experienced his prophetic powers as some visitation of guilt, that foresight stripped him naked. Kay becomes the appalled yet almost impatient accessory to the crime carried out on him. There is in every suicide simultaneously apologia and acquiescence, as the chaplain pronounces in the most desolate of mockeries. But is it that? The court wants nothing from you. It receives you when you come, and it dismisses you when you go. The formula comes deliberately close to being a definition of human life, of the freedom to be culpable, which is that of fallen man. Who but Kafka could have put it in so few words, or known himself condemned by being inspired enough to do so? George Steiner.